Miyamoto Musashi fought over 60 duels to the death and never lost. He lived past 60 in an era when most samurai died young. He created masterpiece paintings, wrote enduring philosophy, and never burned out. Meanwhile, his rivals, trained in prestigious schools with every advantage, collapsed under pressure. The difference wasn't talent. It wasn't discipline. It was one brutal rule Musashi never broke. Do not seek pleasure for its own sake. While others optimized for comfort, Musashi optimized for chaos, and chaos came for everyone. Only he was ready. This isn't a story about toughness theater or motivational discipline. This is about why comfort, the thing most people chase as a reward for hard work, becomes the very thing that destroys their ability to function when it matters most. Musashi didn't reject comfort because he was ascetic or morally superior. He rejected it because he understood something that modern society has forgotten. Comfort creates dependency. Dependency creates expectation. Expectation creates hesitation. And hesitation, in his world, meant death. But here's where it gets interesting. Musashi lived during one of the most violent periods in Japanese history, the Sengoku period, when warlords fought for control and samurai died by the thousands. Yet as Japan transitioned into the Edo period, an era of relative peace and structure, Musashi's approach became more relevant, not less. Why? Because comfort had finally arrived. And comfort, it turned out, was more dangerous than war. Chapter 1. The Collapse of Comfort. Kyoto, 1604. The Sengoku period had just ended. For over a century, Japan had been torn apart by civil war. Samurai lived and died by the sword. There was no safety, no stability, no guarantee you'd survive the week. Then Tokugawa Ieyasu unified Japan. The wars ended, the chaos stopped, and for the first time in generations, samurai could breathe. They built estates, they formed schools, they created routines, they optimized for efficiency, they pursued rank and status. They finally had the luxury of comfort. And that's when they started dying in duels. Not because they lacked skill. Many of these samurai were technically brilliant, trained in prestigious schools with refined methods passed down through generations. But when they faced real violence, real unpredictability, real chaos, they froze. Their bodies had adapted to ideal conditions, structured training, predictable opponents. Musashi offered them none of that. While the Yoshioka school in Kyoto taught sword technique in a controlled dojo with proper etiquette and ceremonial structure, Musashi trained in forests, on mountains, in terrible weather, with improvised weapons. While their students learned to fight with the best equipment, Musashi fought with wooden swords. While they arrived on time, composed and prepared, Musashi arrived late, disheveled, disrespectful. He didn't do this to be difficult. He did it because he understood something they didn't. The moment you condition your body to require ideal circumstances, you've already lost. This became most obvious in 1604, when Musashi arrived in Kyoto at age 20 and challenged the Yoshioka school, the most prestigious sword school in Japan. The Yoshioka family had served shoguns. They taught refined technique. They represented everything samurai culture valued: discipline, tradition, honor, comfort earned through mastery. Seijuro Yoshioka, the head of the school, accepted Musashi's challenge. This should have been simple. Seijuro was older, more experienced, trained since childhood in perfect conditions with the best instructors. Musashi was a wandering duelist, with no formal training, no school, no master. The duel was scheduled for dawn at a specific location outside the city. Formal, structured, civilized. Musashi arrived 4 hours late. He showed up disheveled, unarmed except for a wooden training sword, moving like he'd just woken up. Seijuro, who had been waiting in the cold, maintaining perfect posture and mental preparation, was furious. His students surrounded the area, expecting their master to destroy this disrespectful peasant. The fight lasted seconds. Musashi struck once. Seijuro collapsed. The head of the most prestigious sword school in Japan was defeated by a wooden stick wielded by a man who'd slept on the ground the night before. But here's what nobody talks about. Seijuro wasn't weak. He was dependent. His technique required ideal conditions, mental preparation, physical readiness, respectful opponents who followed the rules. When those conditions vanished, so did his ability to function. Musashi had trained himself to function without guarantees. The Yoshioka school, humiliated, sent Seijuro's brother, Denshichiro. This time, they wouldn't follow formalities. They'd ambush Musashi with multiple attackers. Surely overwhelming force would compensate for individual weakness. Thus Musashi killed Denshichiro and several students in a chaotic brawl. Again, not because he was stronger, but because chaos was his training environment. They had optimized for order. He had optimized for disorder. And disorder always wins when order breaks. The Yoshioka school made one final attempt. They sent dozens of students to ambush Musashi in a forest. The plan was simple: surround him, overwhelm him. No honor, no structure, just brutal numerical advantage. But they made one critical mistake. They assumed Musashi would hesitate in disorder, that he would panic when conditions weren't fair. That comfort could be restored if they just applied enough force. Musashi cut through them systematically, not because he was invincible, but because they had trained in a dojo, and he had trained in forests. They expected predictability. He expected chaos, and he'd conditioned his body to function without needing anything to go right. The Yoshioka school never recovered. Within a generation, it was gone. Meanwhile, Musashi continued to wander, refusing titles, refusing schools, refusing comfort. And every time someone conditioned to ideal circumstances challenged him, the result was the same. Comfort had made them fragile, and fragility doesn't survive contact with reality. This pattern would repeat itself 8 years later on an island called Ganryu, where Musashi would face the greatest swordsman in Japan. A man so refined, so technically perfect, so conditioned to ideal circumstances that he couldn't adapt when Musashi changed the conditions. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. First, we need to understand exactly what Musashi knew that killed the Yoshioka school. Not sword technique, something deeper, something most people still don't understand. Comfort doesn't make you weak because it feels good. It makes you weak because it creates dependency, and dependency means you can only function when conditions are right. Musashi built a life where conditions were never right, and that's why he never lost. Chapter 2. The Rule. Musashi never broke. Near the end of his life, Musashi retreated to a cave called Reigando and wrote the Book of 5 Rings. He was dying, and he knew it. Most men in that position write about their accomplishments, their victories, their legacy. Musashi wrote about principles. One line appears early in the text, blunt and uncompromising. Do not seek pleasure for its own sake. Not avoid all pleasure, not suffer needlessly. Seek pleasure for its own sake. The distinction matters. Musashi didn't reject comfort because he thought it was morally wrong. He rejected it because it created a pattern his body would expect. And expectation, he understood, was the enemy of adaptability. Here's how it works. Your body learns from repetition. If you sleep in a soft bed every night, your body adapts to soft beds. If you eat warm meals at regular intervals, your body expects warm meals at regular intervals. If you train in a controlled environment with predictable conditions, your nervous system calibrates to controlled environments. This isn't weakness, it's efficiency. Your body is doing exactly what it's designed to do, optimizing for the conditions you provide. The problem emerges when conditions change. A samurai conditioned to sleeping in a warm room hesitates when forced to sleep in the cold. Not because he can't endure cold, but because his body is negotiating with the discomfort, trying to restore the baseline it's learned to expect. That negotiation, that moment of hesitation, creates a gap between decision and action. In Musashi's world, that gap was lethal. So he built a life with no baseline. He owned almost nothing. 2 swords, occasionally 1. Sparse clothing, often threadbare. No permanent residence. He slept on floors, on dirt, in temples, under trees. He traveled constantly, never settling long enough for his body to expect stability. People who met him described his appearance as rough, almost vagrant. His clothes were simple, sometimes unwashed. His hair unkempt. He looked nothing like the polished samurai who served lords and maintained estates. Those samurai carried themselves with dignity earned through status. Musashi carried himself with the posture of someone who needed nothing from anyone. This wasn't aesthetics, it was strategy. When Musashi arrived at duels disheveled and late, his opponents saw disrespect. They were partly right. But the disrespect wasn't personal, it was tactical. He was stripping away their expectations, forcing them into conditions their training hadn't prepared them for. His opponents had trained to fight composed, rested, mentally prepared adversaries who followed ritual. Musashi gave them none of that. He forced them to adapt in real time, and their bodies, conditioned to ideal circumstances, couldn't respond fast enough. The same pattern appeared in every aspect of his life. He was offered positions, titles, students who would pay him well. And he refused, not out of pride, but because accepting meant obligations, and obligations meant predictability, and predictability meant his body would start expecting certain conditions. Other samurai built schools. Musashi remained alone. Other samurai secured patronage. Musashi wandered. Other samurai sought legacy through lineage. Musashi sought understanding through isolation. Records describe him living for weeks at a time in remote locations with minimal supplies, training alone, painting alone, writing alone. Not as punishment, as calibration. He was teaching his body that it didn't get to demand anything. Comfort when available, fine. Discomfort when necessary, equally fine. No preference, no negotiation. This is where most people misunderstand Musashi's approach. They think he was tough, that he pushed through discomfort with willpower. That's not what the historical accounts suggest. Musashi didn't fight discomfort. He removed the fight entirely by eliminating expectation. A body that expects nothing can't be disappointed. A mind that requires nothing can't hesitate. Compare this to the samurai who served in castles. They had status, comfort, predictable routines. They ate well, slept well, trained in controlled conditions. By every reasonable measure, they should have been stronger than a wandering duelist who owned nothing. But when chaos arrived, when conditions shifted, when the predictable became unpredictable, their bodies couldn't adapt fast enough. The comfort they'd earned had trained them for one type of reality. Musashi had trained himself for every type of reality by refusing to let his body settle into any single pattern. This is the uncomfortable part. Comfort isn't evil. Comfort is useful. The problem is dependency. The moment your ability to function requires comfort, you've created a weakness, not a moral failing, a structural vulnerability. Musashi wrote, "In strategy, it is important to see distant things as if they were close and to take a distance view of close things." He was talking about spatial perception in combat, but the principle applies to comfort. Most people see comfort as close, immediate, necessary. They see discomfort as distant, temporary, something to avoid. Musashi inverted this. He saw comfort as a distant luxury his body didn't need. He saw discomfort as close, normal, the default state of existence. This wasn't pessimism, it was calibration. By the time he faced his final major duel on Ganryu Island, this pattern was so deeply ingrained that chaos wasn't an obstacle, it was his advantage. His opponent would arrive with expectations, Musashi would arrive with none. And in the gap between what his opponent expected and what Musashi delivered, the fight would be decided. But first, we need to understand how Musashi trained, because rejecting comfort wasn't enough. He had to build capacity in its absence, and that required a very different approach to practice than anything the formal schools taught. Chapter 3. Training under worst conditions. Most samurai trained in the morning, rested, fed, mentally sharp. They practiced forms in controlled environments with proper equipment and structured progression. This made sense. Training under ideal conditions allows you to refine technique, identify flaws, build precision. Musashi trained when he was exhausted. Historical accounts describe him practicing sword strikes after traveling all day, swinging heavy wooden swords in darkness, drilling movements while hungry or cold. This wasn't discipline theater. It was deliberate conditioning for a specific outcome. Here's what he understood. Your body performs differently under stress. Fatigue changes your biomechanics. Hunger alters your decision-making. Cold affects your grip and reaction time. If you only train in ideal conditions, your technique exists in a narrow bandwidth. The moment conditions shift, your body has to adapt in real time while also executing complex movements under pressure. That adaptation costs time, fractions of a second maybe. But in a duel to the death, fractions of a second decide everything. So Musashi eliminated the gap. He trained his technique to exist at the lowest possible baseline, not the highest. If he could execute a strike properly while exhausted, cold, and mentally drained, then executing it while rested became trivial. His body didn't need to adapt downward under pressure. It was already there. This extended to equipment. Formal schools trained with proper swords, balanced and maintained. Students learned to feel the weight, the edge alignment, the specific handling characteristics of quality weapons. Again, this makes sense for refinement. Musashi trained with sticks, boat oars, broken swords, anything he could find. On Ganryu Island, he famously carved a sword from an oar during the boat ride to the duel. People remember this as improvisation. It wasn't. It was standard practice for him. He'd been training with improvised weapons for years. Why? Because a body conditioned to ideal equipment hesitates with imperfect equipment. The weight feels wrong. The balance is off. The mind has to recalibrate. That recalibration, again, costs time. Musashi's body didn't recalibrate. It didn't matter what he held. A sword, a stick, a piece of wood. His technique wasn't built around the tool. The tool served the technique. This sounds like a minor detail. It determined the outcome of multiple duels. The same logic applied to environment. Formal schools trained on flat, even ground. Musashi trained on hillsides, in forests, on uneven terrain. When he fought Seijuro Yoshioka, the location was chosen for its flat, open space, perfect dueling ground. Musashi arrived late and fought immediately, giving himself no time to assess or prepare. He'd already trained his body not to need assessment or preparation. But the pattern goes deeper than physical conditioning. There's a psychological component most people miss. When you train in comfort, your body learns that action follows preparation. You warm up, you stretch, you mentally rehearse. You create a ritual that signals to your nervous system, now we perform. This works brilliantly for planned execution. It fails catastrophically when action must be immediate. Musashi's training eliminated preparation rituals. He would go from stillness to full combat speed with no transition. Records describe him attacking at the beginning of duels before his opponents had finished their formal stances, before the ceremonial aspects were complete, sometimes before they'd even fully drawn their swords. His opponents called this dishonorable. They were right by the standards of samurai culture. But Musashi wasn't optimizing for honor. He was optimizing for survival. And survival doesn't wait for you to feel ready. This created a specific tactical advantage. His opponent's nervous systems expected a sequence: formal greeting, stance, mental preparation, engagement. Their bodies were conditioned to move through these phases. When Musashi skipped phases or arrived in a state that disrupted the sequence, their bodies had to override trained patterns in real time. That override created the same gap: hesitation, recalibration, mental negotiation between what should happen and what is happening. In that gap, Musashi struck. This wasn't about being faster, but it was about removing the pause his opponents couldn't avoid. They had trained their bodies to negotiate with conditions. He had trained his body to execute regardless of conditions. The difference wasn't speed, it was the absence of delay. Consider his late arrivals. Samurai duels followed strict protocol. Arrive at dawn. Both parties present themselves with dignity. There's a formal exchange, sometimes involving seconds or witnesses. The fight begins when both parties are ready. This structure served a purpose. It demonstrated courage, respect, and adherence to Bushido. Musashi arrived hours late, sometimes looking like he'd just woken up, sometimes appearing irritated or distracted. His opponents, who had been maintaining perfect mental composure for hours, found their carefully constructed readiness disrupted. They were angry, thrown off, forced to re-enter the mental state they'd built earlier. Meanwhile, Musashi's mental state didn't change. He didn't need a state. He didn't build himself up for action. He existed at a constant baseline of readiness that didn't require maintenance. While his opponents were trying to reconstruct their preparation, he was already in motion. This happened repeatedly. Before Kyoto, Musashi fought a duelist named Arima Kihei, a skilled swordsman from a respected school. The duel was set for a specific time. Musashi arrived late. Arima was furious. The fight lasted seconds. Arima's anger disrupted his technique. Musashi's technique didn't require emotional stability. It existed independent of his emotional state because he trained it to function in chaos. The pattern continued with the Yoshioka school. 3 separate duels, 3 late arrivals, 3 opponents who expected structure and received disruption. Each time, their training, which emphasized ideal conditions and proper form, became a liability. They couldn't adapt fast enough because their bodies had never been forced to. Here's the reframe most people miss. Optimization creates efficiency, but efficiency creates fragility. When you optimize a system for specific conditions, you increase performance in those conditions. You also increase vulnerability when conditions change. A race car performs brilliantly on a track. It fails immediately on rough terrain. Formal samurai training optimized for duels that followed structure. Musashi trained for duels that followed no structure. When structure broke down, which it always did in real violence, their optimization became a weakness. His lack of optimization became an advantage. This is why his approach worked. Not because hardship builds character or suffering creates strength, because training in worst conditions builds capacity that doesn't collapse when conditions worsen. Training in ideal conditions builds capacity that exists only while conditions remain ideal. Most samurai built a house on solid ground. Musashi built a house that could stand anywhere. When the ground shifted, their houses fell. His remained standing. This would become undeniable on Ganryu Island, where the greatest technical swordsman in Japan would face Musashi under conditions that negated every advantage technique could provide. But before we get there, we need to understand what happened to the institution that represented everything Musashi rejected. The Yoshioka school didn't just lose duels. It collapsed completely. And the reason reveals exactly why comfort destroys systems faster than it destroys individuals. Chapter 4. The System That Failed. The Yoshioka school wasn't just prestigious. It was an institution. For generations, the Yoshioka family had taught sword technique to shoguns, daimyo, and elite samurai. Their method was refined, systematic, passed down through careful lineage. Students paid significant sums to train there. Graduating from the Yoshioka school meant something. It opened doors, established credibility, connected you to a network of power. By 1604, the school represented everything samurai culture valued: tradition, structure, proven methods, social legitimacy. They had survived the chaos of the Sengoku period by maintaining standards while others collapsed. They had adapted to the new Edo stability by becoming the premium training ground for samurai who wanted technical excellence. Then Musashi walked into Kyoto and destroyed them in 3 encounters over the span of months. The first duel with Seijuro Yoshioka was supposed to be straightforward. Seijuro was the head of the school, trained since childhood, technically superior by every metric that mattered to sword schools. Musashi was 20, with no formal training, no school affiliation, no reputation beyond being difficult. Seijuro expected a proper duel, dawn meeting, formal positioning, traditional engagement. His students surrounded the area, confident they were about to witness their master's superiority demonstrated. The Yoshioka method emphasized precise angles, controlled breathing, perfect form. Seijuro had internalized this method completely. Musashi arrived 4 hours late with a wooden sword, not as insult, though it was insulting, as tactic. The wooden sword was heavier than Seijuro's steel blade, which meant different timing, different impact force. Seijuro's muscle memory was calibrated to steel meeting steel. Musashi gave him wood meeting steel. The sensory feedback was wrong. The weight distribution was wrong. The sound was wrong. One strike. Seijuro collapsed, not killed, but incapacitated, humiliated in front of his students. The head of the most prestigious sword school in Japan had been defeated by a man who looked like he'd slept in the woods. The school's response revealed their fundamental problem, that instead of analyzing what had happened, they escalated. Seijuro's brother, Denshichiro, challenged Musashi. This time there would be no formality, no waiting. They would meet and fight immediately. Denshichiro was younger, faster, angrier. He carried a longer staff, thinking reach would compensate for whatever advantage Musashi had found. The duel was set for a specific location. Musashi, again, arrived late. Again, he used a wooden sword. Again, he struck before Denshichiro had fully settled into position. Denshichiro died. Now the school faced a crisis. 2 leaders defeated. Their reputation was crumbling. Students were leaving. The systematic method that had built their prestige was being systematically dismantled by someone who rejected their entire framework. The final attempt wasn't a duel. It was an ambush. The Yoshioka school gathered dozens of students and retainers, armed them with swords and bows, and planned to surround Musashi in a forest outside Kyoto. No honor, no structure, just overwhelming force. If technique couldn't defeat him, numbers would. They set the meeting for a specific time and location. A rice field near a temple where they could position archers in trees and swordsmen in the grass. Musashi would arrive, step into the trap, and die under a storm of arrows and blades. Simple, effective, final. Musashi arrived early. He came hours before the planned time, hid, and waited. When the Yoshioka forces arrived and began positioning themselves, he attacked from behind before they'd finished setting up. The ambush became chaos. Students trained in structured combat found themselves in a brawl with no formations, and no clear allies, no plan. Musashi moved through them methodically. Some died, the rest scattered. The Yoshioka school never recovered. Within a generation, it was gone. Not because Musashi had killed everyone, but because he'd exposed the fundamental flaw in their system. They had built everything around structure. Their technique required structure. Their teaching methods assumed structure. Their reputation was based on structured superiority. When structure disappeared, their entire system collapsed. They couldn't adapt because adaptation wasn't part of the method. The method was the point. This is where institutions fail. A system optimized for stability becomes dependent on stability. The more refined the system, the more dependent it becomes. The Yoshioka school had spent generations removing variables, controlling conditions, of perfecting technique within known parameters. This created excellence within those parameters. It also created catastrophic vulnerability when parameters changed. Musashi wasn't better at fighting within their system. He was better at destroying systems. He didn't challenge them on their terms. He changed the terms, and they couldn't function under changed terms because their training had never included changed terms. Compare this to Musashi's approach. No system, no school, no methodology that required specific conditions. He trained alone, traveled constantly, fought whoever challenged him under whatever conditions existed. His capacity wasn't built around a framework. It existed independent of frameworks. When the Yoshioka school tried to formalize their response, create structure around defeating him, and he simply operated outside their structure. They positioned archers. He arrived early. They planned an ambush. He ambushed the ambush. Every attempt to impose order gave him something to exploit. This pattern appears repeatedly in military history. Refined systems defeat other refined systems until someone arrives who refuses to engage systematically. Then the refined system optimized for fighting other refined systems, discovers it has no capacity for fighting chaos. The optimization that created superiority becomes the vulnerability that ensures defeat. The Yoshioka school represents this perfectly. They weren't weak, they were specialized. Specialization dominated in stable conditions among similar opponents. Musashi offered neither stability nor similarity. He offered chaos in human form, and chaos doesn't lose to systems. But chaos erodes systems until the system collapses or adapts. The Yoshioka school couldn't adapt. Their entire identity was the system. Abandoning the system meant abandoning what made them the Yoshioka school. So they held to their methods, escalated force, and collapsed. Musashi walked away and continued wandering. No school, no students, no institution, just capacity that existed anywhere under any conditions. The very thing that made him seem primitive, his lack of systematic refinement, was what allowed him to survive when systematic refinement failed. 8 years later, this pattern would reach its ultimate expression. Musashi would face not a school, but an individual who represented the absolute peak of technical perfection. A swordsman so refined, so precisely calibrated, that he was considered unbeatable by everyone who understood sword technique. His name was Sasaki Kojiro, and he was about to discover that perfection only exists under perfect conditions. Chapter 5. The Final Proof. Sasaki Kojiro was everything Musashi wasn't. Polished, refined, technically flawless. He had studied under the Toda school, one of the most respected sword traditions in Japan. His signature technique, the swallow's reversal, was legendary. A strike so fast and precise, it resembled a swallow changing direction mid-flight. No wasted movement, no excess energy, pure mechanical perfection. He carried a nodachi, a sword longer than standard katanas, nearly 4 feet of blade. The extra reach gave him a significant tactical advantage. He could strike from distances other swordsmen couldn't match. Combined with his speed and precision, this made him nearly untouchable. Opponents died before they could close the distance. By 1612, Kojiro's reputation was established. He served the Hosokawa clan, received a comfortable stipend, lived in relative security. He was the model of what a samurai could achieve through dedication to technical mastery. Everything the Yoshioka school had aspired to be, Kojiro had become. Perfect technique, refined through ideal training conditions, proven against quality opponents. When Musashi challenged him, Kojiro accepted immediately. This would be the definitive duel. The wandering vagrant versus the master technician. Chaos versus refinement. The question would finally be answered. Does systematic perfection defeat adaptability, or does adaptability expose perfection's limitations? The duel was set for Ganryu Island, a small island in the strait between Honshu and Kyushu. April 13, 1612. Early morning. The location was chosen for its isolation and flat terrain. Perfect dueling ground. No variables, no complications. Just 2 swordsmen and open space. Kojiro arrived early. He brought seconds, witnesses from the Hosokawa clan who wanted to watch their champion's inevitable victory. He wore formal attire, carried his nodachi properly, maintained perfect composure. Everything about his presence communicated readiness, dignity, preparation. He had trained for this. His body was calibrated. His mind was focused. The conditions were ideal. Musashi was late. Very late. Hours late. Kojiro waited on the beach, maintaining his mental state, keeping his body warm and ready. The sun rose higher. Morning became midday. His seconds grew concerned. Some thought Musashi wouldn't come, that he'd recognized the impossibility of winning and fled. Others thought he was playing psychological games, trying to frustrate Kojiro into making mistakes. Both were wrong. Musashi was carving a sword from a boat oar. When Musashi finally arrived, rowing the boat himself, Kojiro saw immediately that something was wrong. Musashi looked disheveled, his hair tied with a torn piece of cloth. He carried a wooden sword, crudely shaped, longer than a standard bokken. He stepped off the boat and walked toward Kojiro without ceremony, without formal greeting, without any acknowledgement of protocol. Kojiro, frustrated by the wait and insulted by Musashi's appearance, drew his nodachi and threw the scabbard aside. The gesture was meant to communicate finality. This fight would end in death. No retreat, no surrender. Musashi smiled. "You've already lost. A man who throws away his scabbard has no confidence he'll need it again." They faced each other. Kojiro in perfect stance, weight distributed precisely, blade angle optimal. Musashi standing casually, wooden sword held loosely, body position almost careless. To anyone trained in sword technique, the contrast was absurd. Kojiro looked like a master. Musashi looked like he'd wandered into the wrong place. Then Musashi moved, not into a stance, directly into attack. No preparation, no formal beginning, just immediate forward motion. Kojiro responded perfectly, his technique flawless, his nodachi cutting through the air in a strike that should have ended the fight. But Musashi had positioned himself with the sun behind him. Kojiro's perfect technique executed against glare, his timing, calibrated through thousands of hours in controlled lighting, was off by fractions. The nodachi cut through Musashi's headband. Musashi's wooden sword struck Kojiro's skull. One exchange. Seconds. Kojiro collapsed. He died shortly after, either from the blow itself or from drowning as the tide came in. The accounts vary. What doesn't vary is that the most technically perfect swordsman in Japan was killed by a piece of wood wielded by a man who'd spent the morning carving it on a boat. This wasn't luck. This was the inevitable result of two different training philosophies meeting under real conditions. Kojiro had optimized every element of his technique for ideal circumstances. Controlled lighting, proper equipment, formal engagement. His perfection existed within a bandwidth of specific conditions. Musashi had optimized for chaos. Late arrival meant Kojiro's carefully maintained readiness degraded. Sun positioning meant Kojiro's visual calibration was compromised. Wooden sword meant the sensory feedback was wrong. Immediate attack meant there was no time for Kojiro to adjust from formal expectation to brutal reality. Every advantage Kojiro possessed, his longer blade, his superior technique, his formal training, required conditions to remain stable. Musashi didn't fight within stable conditions. He created instability and fought inside it. Kojiro's body, conditioned through years of refinement in controlled environments, couldn't adapt fast enough. This is the core lesson. Refinement creates excellence within boundaries. Set adaptability creates survival when boundaries disappear. Kojiro represented the peak of what systematic training could produce. Musashi represented what happens when you train for the absence of systems. The duel on Ganryu Island wasn't a contest between two sword techniques. It was a test of two different relationships with conditions. Kojiro needed conditions to be right. Musashi needed nothing to be right. When conditions stopped being right, which happened the moment Musashi arrived, Kojiro's perfection became irrelevant. Witnesses described Musashi walking back to his boat after the strike, not celebrating, not even acknowledging what had happened. He simply left. No ceremony, no claim of victory, no dramatic gesture. He'd proven what he needed to prove: comfort, refinement, and systematic perfection all collapse when someone refuses to provide the conditions they require. Kojiro died not because he was weak, but because his strength existed only under specific circumstances. Musashi survived not because he was stronger, but because his capacity existed independent of circumstances. One man had built a palace that required perfect weather. The other had built a shelter that could stand in any storm. The palace, no matter how beautiful, falls when the storm arrives. The shelter, no matter how crude, remains standing. That's not philosophy, that's structure. And structure determines survival more than skill ever will. Chapter 6. The Rule That Outlived Musashi. After Ganryu Island, Musashi could have stopped. He'd proven his point. His reputation was established. He was offered positions, students, patronage. Daimyo wanted him to teach their samurai. Wealthy families wanted him to establish schools. He could have built an institution, accumulated wealth, lived comfortably for the rest of his life. He refused everything. For the next 30 years, Musashi continued wandering. Not because he had nowhere to go, but because settling meant accepting conditions, and accepting conditions meant his body would start expecting them. He painted, wrote, sculpted. His artwork from this period shows the same principle that governed his swordsmanship. Minimal strokes, no excess. Nothing included that didn't serve the essential form. He lived in temples occasionally, caves sometimes, the homes of those who offered shelter when convenient. Never permanently. Never long enough for permanence to become expectation. His possessions remained sparse. His clothing remained simple. At 60, he looked and lived like he had at 20. No accumulation, no softening, no gradual drift toward ease. This wasn't stubbornness, it was consistency. The rule that kept him alive in duels applied equally to everything else. Do not seek pleasure for its own sake. Not just in combat, in all things. Food, shelter, social status, artistic recognition. He accepted these when they appeared, declined them when accepting meant obligation. In 1643, 2 years before his death, Musashi retreated to Reigando, a cave on Mount Iwato in Kumamoto. He was sick, his body finally failing after decades of exposure and hardship. He knew he was dying. He used the time to write the Book of Five Rings, dictating his understanding of strategy and combat to his student Tarao Magonoho. The text doesn't read like a master's final wisdom wrapped in mysticism. It reads like tactical observations from someone who tested principles under lethal conditions and found which ones held. Direct, sparse, pragmatic. The same minimalism that characterized his swordsmanship and art appears in his writing. No wasted words. No philosophical flourishes for their own sake, just structure. One section addresses training explicitly. In strategy, your spiritual bearing must not be any different from normal. Both in fighting and in everyday life, you should be determined, though calm. Not calm as a mood. Calm as a baseline that doesn't shift based on conditions. The same mental state in a duel as in a conversation. No special preparation, no altered consciousness. Consistent readiness that doesn't require activation. Thus, another passage reinforces the core principle that governed his life. It is difficult to understand the universe if you only study one planet. He's describing the problem with specialization, with optimization, with comfort. A body trained in ideal conditions only understands ideal conditions. A technique refined in controlled environments only functions in controlled environments. Real adaptability requires exposure to chaos, not mastery within structure. Throughout the text, Musashi returns to the same theme. Remove what doesn't serve. Eliminate excess. Function without requiring specific circumstances. This wasn't philosophy to him. It was engineering. Build capacity that doesn't collapse when conditions change, because conditions always change. He died in 1645, age 61, older than most samurai of his era, especially those who'd fought as many duels. His body had endured decades of hardship, minimal medical care, constant exposure. By comfort-based logic, he should have died young. The aristocratic samurai who lived in castles, ate well, slept in warm rooms, should have outlived him. Many didn't. Comfort preserved them in controlled conditions, but left them vulnerable when conditions shifted. Disease, political upheaval, violence. The stability they'd optimized for disappeared, and their bodies, conditioned to require that stability, couldn't adapt. Musashi's body had never required stability. It functioned in chaos because chaos was its training environment. When instability came, which it always does eventually, his capacity remained intact while others collapsed. The lesson extends beyond martial arts. Every time you condition yourself to require specific circumstances, you've created a dependency. That dependency becomes a structural weakness, not immediately. Dependencies feel like comfort, like earned ease, like reasonable expectation. They only reveal themselves as weaknesses when circumstances change and your capacity disappears with them. Comfort isn't rest. Rest is recovery. Rest restores capacity. Comfort is the expectation that conditions will remain favorable, and that expectation trains your body to function only while conditions remain favorable. The moment conditions stop being favorable, comfort reveals itself as fragility. Musashi's rule, "Do not seek pleasure for its own sake," wasn't about suffering or asceticism or moral superiority. It was about maintaining capacity independent of circumstances. A pleasure when it appears, fine. Comfort when available, acceptable, but never required, never expected, never built into the structure of how you function. This is what outlived Musashi. Not his duels, not his reputation, not his victories. The principle that capacity built in the absence of guarantees survives when guarantees disappear. Strength isn't the ability to perform under ideal conditions. Strength is the ability to function when nothing is ideal, when nothing goes right, when every circumstance that should be favorable isn't. Musashi proved this repeatedly until the day he died, not with philosophy, with structure. He built himself to stand anywhere, under any conditions, requiring nothing. And when conditions collapsed around others, when their optimized systems failed, and their comfortable routines betrayed them, and he remained standing. That's not toughness, that's not discipline, that's architecture. And architecture, unlike motivation or willpower, doesn't fade when circumstances worsen. It's either built to handle instability, or it isn't. Musashi built himself for instability. Everyone else built themselves for a world that no longer existed the moment chaos arrived. Only one of those structures survives contact with reality.